Hey guys, tonight we're heading west, way west, to the muddy, chaotic, gold-flecked fever dream that was the California Gold Rush. Not the version with the adorable little prospector panning peacefully in a babbling brook. I mean the real one. Filthy, desperate, brilliantly corrupt, and absolutely crawling with people who realized very quickly that the real money wasn't in the ground at all. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a very genuine, warm thank you to the listener who suggested this one. You know who you are, and honestly this topic is perfect. Your suggestions genuinely shape what this channel becomes, and I'm grateful every time someone takes the time to send one in. It means a lot. And if you haven't already, the channel is now live on Spotify. Link is in the description if you'd rather drift off there. Now dim the lights, turn on a fan, get your blanket situation sorted, and settle in somewhere that isn't a tent full of strangers who haven't bathed since Ohio. Because let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually took to profit from the gold rush without ever touching a single flake of gold? Did anyone just look at 40,000 sunburned, dehydrated men swarming into the California wilderness and think, yes, but what do they need to buy? Who was selling the shovels? Who was charging $1 for an egg? Who looked at a man who just walked 2,000 miles and said, that'll be $40 for a pair of trousers, sir, and meant it? Could you build a fortune selling bad food, worse whiskey, and canvas pants to men too desperate to argue? And who exactly looked at this entire golden catastrophe and said, I'm not digging, I'm going to get rich off the people who are? Congratulations. The year is 1849. You have just opened a general store in San Francisco, and outside your door a man is crying over a broken pickaxe. This is your moment. It starts with a rumour, the way most disasters do. In January of 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall is working at a sawmill on the American River in Coloma, California, a place so remote and unremarkable that most people couldn't find it on a map, even if they were standing in it. He glances down into the water one morning, and there it is, a glint, a shimmer, something that shouldn't be there but absolutely is. Marshall picks it up. He shows it to his boss, John Sutter, and the two of them do their very best to keep quiet about it. They fail spectacularly. By the time President James K. Polk officially confirmed the discovery in December of that same year, the news had already escaped into the world like a dog through a broken fence. Fast, excited, and completely impossible to catch. What follows is one of the most chaotic mass migrations in human history, set off not by war, not by famine, but by a shiny rock in a river and the very human inability to keep a secret. Sutter himself was not thrilled. He had built a private agricultural empire in the Sacramento Valley, a mill, a fort, thousands of acres, and the last thing he wanted was 100,000 strangers trampling through it. He swore his workers to silence. His workers told their friends. Well, their friends told strangers on the road. The strangers told everybody. Within weeks, rumours were circulating in San Francisco. Within months, they had reached the east coast of Mexico, Chile, Hawaii, China, and Australia. The story mutated as it travelled. The way all good rumours do, the gold grew larger, the effort required to find it shrank. The riches multiplied. By the time the story reached a farmer in Ohio or a clerk in Boston, California had been transformed in the collective imagination into a place where men were simply bending over and picking up fortunes, which was, to be fair, occasionally and briefly true, but only occasionally and only briefly. The announcement that truly lit the fuse came in December of 1848, when President Polk confirmed the discovery in his address to Congress and the U.S. War Department, sent a tea caddy containing 230 ounces of California gold to Washington as proof, 230 ounces on display in the Capitol. The effect was immediate and total. Newspapers that had been running cautious, skeptical stories about California suddenly pivoted to headlines that might as well have read, "Drop everything." Men quit jobs, abandoned farms, dissolved partnerships, and borrowed money they had no realistic plan to repay, all to get to California before, in their imagining, all the gold ran out. What almost nobody stopped to consider was the gap between the rumour and the reality. California was not a short trip. It was not a comfortable trip. It was not for many people a survivable trip. And the gold, as while real, was not lying on the surface waiting patiently. It required back-breaking labour in cold water, with equipment you had to buy at prices designed to separate you from whatever money you'd managed to bring. But here is the thing about gold fever. It is spectacularly resistant to practical information. Men who were told the journey was dangerous went anyway. Men who were told the work was hard went anyway. Men who were shown the arithmetic, cost of passage, cost of equipment, cost of food, probability of finding anything went anyway. The news that started everything wasn't just a news story. It was a collective hallucination dressed up as a financial opportunity. And for a small, sharp-eyed group of people watching the stampede begin, that was the most interesting information of all. Before anyone could get rich in California, they had to survive getting there, and in 1849 that was a genuinely impressive feat of stubbornness. The 49ers, as they'd come to be known, had three options: sail around the entire tip of South America, brave a shortcut through the disease-ridden jungles of Panama, or trek overland across 2,000 miles of prairie, desert and mountain range. None of these options were good. The sea route could take 5 to 8 months, assuming scurvy didn't get you first and your ship didn't decide to quietly sink somewhere off Cape Horn. The Panama route was faster, but the jungle was actively trying to kill you with cholera, yellow fever, and a level of humidity that made breathing feel like a personal insult. The overland trail was cheaper but came with its own collection of horrors: broken wagon wheels, their waterless stretches, the occasional hostile encounter, and the very real possibility of becoming a cautionary tale your children would later learn about in school. The Cape Horn route was the original option for wealthy travellers. Book a berth on a sailing ship, endure 5 to 8 months of open ocean, and arrive in San Francisco having experienced everything the sea could throw at a human body. Seasickness was universal and lasted weeks. Food aboard ship ranged from monotonous to actively threatening. Fresh water ran short on longer voyages. The rounding of Cape Horn itself, that violent wind-hammered stretch of water at the bottom of South America, broke ships and spirits with cheerful regularity. And all of this cost money. A cabin berth on a decent vessel ran several $100s, which in 1849 represented the annual wages of a labourer. The men who couldn't afford cabin passage travelled in steerage, which was essentially the ship's hold with a thin layer of optimism spread over it. The Panama route cut months off the journey, but introduced a different category of misery. You'd sail to Panama, cross the isthmus, 50 miles of jungle that felt like 500, and then wait on the Pacific side for another ship to California. The crossing itself was done by canoe and a mule, through heat and mud and mosquitoes that seemed personally invested in your suffering. The wait on the Pacific coast could stretch for weeks, during which cholera was doing its patient, methodical work through the assembled crowds. Men who survived the crossing and the wait and the second voyage arrived in San Francisco thinner, paler, and significantly more desperate than when they'd left home, which made them, as it happens, excellent customers. The overland route was the choice of men who either couldn't afford the sea passage or simply didn't trust water. Wagon trains formed up in Missouri, in Iowa, in Illinois, and set out in spring to cross the continent before the mountain passes closed in autumn. The math was unforgiving. Wagons broke down. Oxen died. Water sources marked on maps turned out not to exist. The 49ers who crossed the Sierra Nevada in autumn were racing against the same calendar that had destroyed the Donner Party 2 years earlier, a fact they were all aware of and preferred not to discuss around the campfire. Getting to California was expensive, exhausting, and often fatal, which meant that by the time people actually arrived, they were already primed to spend every cent they had on anything that resembled comfort. The men who'd endured 5 months at sea or 3 months on the trail had been ground down to a state of pure, uncomplicated want. They wanted food that didn't taste like salt and regret. They wanted a dry place to sleep. They wanted a drink. And the people waiting for them in San Francisco, with all of those things for sale, were about to have a very good year. While most of the country was still deciding whether to believe the gold reports, a small, sharp-eyed group of people was already doing math. Sam Brannan was perhaps the most famous of them, a newspaper publisher and merchant in San Francisco who, before running through the streets shouting about gold, allegedly waving a bottle of the stuff in the air for maximum drama, he had quietly stocked his general store with every pick, pan and shovel he could get his hands on. Within weeks, he was reportedly clearing $6,000 a day. He hadn't dug an ounce of gold himself. He'd simply asked the one question that the history books rarely spotlight. If every man in the territory is about to go chasing the same thing, what will they all need to buy on the way? The men who answered that question early and correctly didn't just get rich. They got rich fast, got rich reliably, and mostly got to keep their fingernails clean in the process. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself in increasingly creative ways for the next several years. Brannan's genius was in the sequencing. He saw the gold before the crowds did, literally, since he was one of the first people outside of Sutter's operation to be told about the discovery, and he understood that the window between knowledge and competition was the most valuable window of all. He didn't advertise what he was doing. He just bought mining equipment, dry goods, food staples, anything a man heading into the wilderness would need. He bought until his stores were full, and then he went and stood in the street and created the demand himself. It was, depending on your moral framework, either a masterpiece of entrepreneurial timing or a moderately cynical manipulation of public panic. Probably both. By the time rival merchants understood what was happening and tried to stock the same goods, Brannan had already sold most of his inventory at prices that would have seemed absurd 6 months earlier. The pattern he established was repeated in varying forms by dozens of other merchants in the month that followed. Men arrived in San Francisco from the East Coast and from abroad, with ships full of goods, having read the same reports everyone else had read, and having drawn the same conclusion: the miners need things, and whoever gets here first with those things gets paid first, best, and most. Some of them were right. Some arrived to find the market already saturated, prices falling, competition established. The difference between the men who made fortunes and the men who merely broke even was almost entirely a function of timing, which in practice meant information. How early did you hear? How quickly did you act? How clearly did you read the gap between what people needed and what was currently available? The deeper truth that the early merchants understood, and that the gold seekers often didn't, was that certainty beat speculation every time. The miners were gambling on finding gold. The merchants were not gambling at all. They were selling to a captured audience with a documented need and no other options. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the stuff of legend. But it worked, consistently and reliably, in a way that swinging a pickaxe into a California riverbed absolutely did not. Let's talk about eggs. In the years just before the gold rush, an egg in California cost roughly what an egg cost anywhere, a cent or two, a minor, forgettable transaction. By 1849 and into the early 1850s, a single egg in the mining camps could cost as much as $1. For context, A skilled labourer back east was earning maybe $1 a day. So yes, breakfast was now technically a day's wages. This wasn't an accident or a mystery. It was basic supply and demand wearing very expensive shoes. Tens of thousands of people had flooded into a region that had almost no existing food infrastructure, no established farms, no supply chains, and no competition to keep prices honest. Merchants charged what they could get away with, which in the early days was essentially whatever number they felt like writing on a sign. Flour, bacon, boots, candles, coffee, rope, nails. Every single thing a person needed to survive and work had been transformed from an ordinary object into a small financial negotiation. The men who controlled those goods weren't digging for gold, they were printing it. The price inflation of Gold Rush California was not subtle. It was not a gentle upward drift. It was a vertical line on a graph, shooting skyward and apparently unconcerned about ever coming back down. A barrel of flour that cost $4 in Missouri in 1848 could sell for $800 in the California mining camps at peak scarcity. Boots worth $1.50 back east sold for $100. A simple pickaxe, the most basic possible tool, cost nothing remarkable anywhere else in the country and cost $30 or $40 in California in the spring of 1848. The miners understood they were being charged extraordinary prices. They paid anyway, because what was the alternative? Go home. They had just spent 6 months and their life savings getting here. What made it worse, or better, depending on which side of the counter you were standing on, was that wages were also high, at least in theory. A man who found gold was suddenly wealthy by any previous standard. This meant he was willing to pay prices that would have been unthinkable back east, because relative to his current income, they seemed manageable. The merchants understood this and priced accordingly. The result was an economy where everyone nominally had a lot of money and everything cost a lot of money, and the actual purchasing power of a California miner was often lower than that of a factory worker in Massachusetts, who was earning a fraction of the wages. The people who suffered most visibly from this inflation were the miners who didn't find gold, which was in fact the majority of them. They had arrived with limited capital. These spent it immediately on the inflated cost of equipment and food, and found themselves in debt to the general store within weeks of arrival, working a claim that was producing almost nothing, unable to leave because they couldn't afford the passage home. The egg that cost $1 was not a funny anecdote for those men. It was evidence of a trap, and the person on the other side of that transaction, pocketing the dollar, understood exactly what it was. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1850 with a load of dry goods and a business plan that did not at any point involve gold. He was 20 years old, Bavarian-born, and had come west to sell fabric, thread, and whatever else he could move to the merchants and miners flooding into the city. What he didn't expect, and what would change his life entirely, was the specific, urgent, and extremely vocal complaint of the California miner. Their pants kept falling apart. The work was brutal. The pockets were critical for carrying tools and samples, and the occasional fistful of gravel and standard trousers simply weren't built for it. In 1873, Strauss partnered with the Nevada tailor named Jacob Davis, who had been reinforcing his customers' pants with copper rivets at stress points, the corners of pockets, the base of the fly, to keep them from tearing. They patented the design together. What followed was arguably the most successful piece of clothing in the history of Western civilization, the blue jean. Levi Strauss never panned for gold. He sold to the people who did, and he ended up far richer than almost all of them. The pants problem sounds trivial until you think about it for 30 seconds and realize it isn't. Mining in 1849 meant crouching in cold water for 8 to 12 hours, hauling gravel, loading and unloading pans, climbing in and out of sluice boxes, and doing all of this while carrying tools, samples, and whatever personal effects a man kept on his person in a place with no real security. Standard trousers, the kind you'd wear to church or to an office, or to any activity that hadn't been specifically designed to destroy fabric, were not up to the task. The seams split, the pockets tore, men were going through trousers at a rate that was, even by the inflated prices of Gold Rush California, becoming financially painful. Jacob Davis was a tailor in Reno, Nevada, who had been making practical workwear for local labourers when a customer's wife came to him with a specific complaint. Her husband kept destroying his pants. Davis, being a practical man, reached for the copper rivets he used for horse blankets and applied them to the stress points of the trousers. The pants held. Word spread. He started selling the reinforced trousers as fast as he could make them. When he realised the idea was valuable enough to protect, he needed a business partner who could help fund the patent application. He wrote to Levi Strauss. Strauss said yes immediately. The patent was granted in 1873, and the two men began manufacturing riveted denim trousers under the brand that bears Strauss's name to this day. The genius of the design was its simplicity. It solved a real problem elegantly and cheaply. And it solved it for a customer base that was large, growing, and not going away. Miners needed the pants. Then railroad workers needed the pants. Then farmers needed the pants. Then everybody needed the pants. Levi Strauss died in 1902, one of the wealthiest men in San Francisco, having built his fortune entirely on the foundational insight that people who are doing hard physical work need clothing that can keep up with them. He never found gold. He found something more durable. San Francisco in the late 1840s looked less like a city and more like a very optimistic pile of wood planks that had arranged itself near a bay and hoped for the best. Housing was, to put it charitably, non-existent. Men arrived by the thousands and needed somewhere to sleep. And the people who could offer them even a rough floor and a roof over their heads discovered very quickly that the demand for shelter was essentially infinite, and the supply was deeply, laughably insufficient. Boarding houses sprang up overnight, some of them literally overnight, thrown together from shipped lumber and the kind of structural confidence that comes from knowing people will pay anything just to not sleep in the mud. Beds were rented in shifts. One man used it from midnight to dawn, the next from dawn to noon, the next from noon to 6. Privacy was a concept that politely did not apply. Walls were thin enough to hear your neighbour's nightmares. And none of that mattered, because the alternative was a tent, and the tent was on a hill, and the hill was currently on fire. Boarding house owners in early San Francisco were, by any reasonable measure, printing money. Some of them became among the wealthiest people in the city, all without ever once checking their pans for colour. The shift bed system is worth pausing on, because it represents a level of commercial ruthlessness that deserves its own quiet moment of appreciation. A single bed, in the most basic boarding house, might be rented to 3 different men across 24 hours. Each of them paid for what was loosely described as a night's sleep, which in practice meant a few hours of horizontal time on a mattress that had already been compressed by strangers and would be compressed by more strangers shortly afterward. The sheets, if there were sheets, were changed infrequently. The blankets were shared, which in the context of an 1849 California boarding house means they were distributed to whoever was currently cold and retrieved when the next shift arrived. This was not a hospitality experience. It was shelter in the most technical possible sense of the word, and men paid $3 to $5 a night for it without complaint. The people who owned these establishments were not merely charging for beds, they were charging for location. San Francisco in the gold rush years was a place where everything cost more the closer it was to the bay, the docks, the commercial centre, the places where men needed to be to do business, collect mail, find work, and hear news. A boarding house within walking distance of the waterfront could charge significantly more than one on the outskirts. and the owners of well-placed properties understood this and priced accordingly. Some of them had bought their land before the rush, at prices that now seemed almost comically low. Others had arrived early enough to establish themselves before the city's commercial real estate market became genuinely competitive. Either way, they were sitting on a gold mine, just not the kind that required a pan. The social texture of the boarding house was also its own strange world. Men from completely different backgrounds, a farmer from Ohio, a sailor from Chile, a failed merchant from Boston, a young man from Canton who had crossed the Pacific on a cargo ship, found themselves sharing a room, sharing a table, sharing a very thin wall. Languages mixed, arguments happened, and friendships formed across distances that would have been impossible anywhere else. The boarding house was chaotic and uncomfortable and frequently loud, and for thousands of men it was the closest thing they had to home for the duration of their time in California. If there is one institution that understood the gold rush better than any mine or merchant, it was the saloon. The logic was bulletproof. Men who spent all day in cold water, bent double over a pan, were going to want a drink at the end of it. Men who just struck it rich were going to want to celebrate. Men who hadn't found anything were going to want to forget. And all of them, universally, regardless of fortune, were going to be profoundly, structurally lonely in a way that only a warm, loud room full of other lonely people could temporarily fix. The saloons in the mining towns charged what would today seem like extraordinary sums for the most ordinary whiskey, liquid that, in many documented cases, had been diluted, adulterated, or creatively mislabeled, and which nonetheless sold faster than the bar could pour it. A glass of rough whiskey cost 50 cents in 1849. A bottle could be $1 or more. For men spending their days making almost nothing after expenses, the saloon was somehow still always full. The gambling tables attached to most saloons were, if anything, even more profitable, reliably extracting the day's earnings from men who had spent 12 hours earning them, with a cheerful efficiency that the mining companies themselves could only envy. The whiskey situation requires a brief note on quality, which is to say, there wasn't any. The whiskey sold in the early California mining towns was drawn from a remarkably creative spectrum of substances, united by the general characteristic of being alcoholic, and the more specific characteristic of being whatever the bartender could source at a price that preserved his margin. Genuine aged whiskey was expensive to ship, slow to produce, and frankly wasted on men who were going to drink it in 3 minutes standing at a plank balanced across 2 barrels. What actually went into many barrels labelled whiskey or brandy or gin or whatever the sign said varied enormously. Alcohol of industrial origins, cheap imported spirits diluted with water, substances that had been coloured and flavoured to approximate the taste of something more expensive. The men drinking it were aware, at some level, that they were not consuming a premium product. They drank it anyway because the point was never really the whiskey. The gambling tables that occupied the back half of most serious saloons were the real engine of the economy. Faro was the dominant game, a card game that was straightforward enough for a tired, mildly drunk miner to understand, and deceptive enough in its odds to ensure that the house came out ahead over any meaningful run of play. Monte, a Mexican card game, was enormously popular in the California camps, where the population was diverse enough that the game had a genuine cultural following. Poker was played in corners, at improvised tables, in tents. The house took a cut of every pot at the professional tables, and the professional tables ran continuously, 24 hours a day in the bigger establishments, because the men cycling through them ensured there was always someone willing to sit down with whatever gold dust remained from the day's work. The saloon owners who owned their buildings, rather than renting, accumulated real estate in boomtown conditions, meaning properties that had cost almost nothing in the period before the rush were worth fortunes by 1850. Several of the men who ran the major saloons in San Francisco became significant property owners in the city. their wealth having started in whiskey and cards and ended in the kind of respectable commercial real estate that nobody asks embarrassing questions about. Here is a detail the Gold Rush history books don't always linger on: the laundry. Tens of thousands of men living in tents and mining camps, doing brutal physical labour in the mud, with no wives, no domestic infrastructure, and a cultural assumption at the time that the washing of clothes was simply not their department. The result was a laundry crisis of almost comedic proportions. Shirts went unwashed for weeks. Socks became geological artifacts. Some men reportedly sent their laundry to Hawaii or China on ships and waited months for it to return clean, which tells you everything you need to know about the gap between supply and demand in early Gold Rush California. The women who moved into the laundry business, and there were many, both in San Francisco and in the camps, charged prices that seem outrageous by any standard. A dozen items washed could cost several dollars. In a world where a miner's daily take was wildly unpredictable, a laundress with a tub and a fire had something he could not: a guaranteed customer base, as daily business and cash in hand. Several women in this industry became quietly, substantially wealthy, far more so than the men whose shirts they were cleaning. The ship laundry detail is real, and it is so perfectly illustrative of the situation that it bears lingering on for a moment. Men were genuinely paying to have their dirty clothes loaded onto ships, sailed to Hawaii, a round trip of several weeks at minimum, and returned clean, rather than wash them by hand in the nearest river. The shipping cost alone would have been significant. The waiting time was extraordinary, and yet the calculus apparently made sense to enough men that it was a documented commercial practice, which tells you something very specific about the state of laundry services in early California. There essentially weren't any, or rather, there weren't enough. And the ones that existed charged so much that send it to Hawaii was in the same price range. The women who established themselves as laundresses in the mining camps occupied a position of unusual economic leverage. They had a skill, or more precisely, they had a willingness to perform labour that the predominantly male camp population considered beneath them or simply beyond their practical knowledge, and they were operating in a market with essentially no competition and essentially infinite demand. They set their own prices, they chose their own hours, they collected their fees in gold dust, which at that moment was as good as money and in many cases better, since it was tangible and immediate. Some of these women built operations that went well beyond a single tub and a clothesline. They hired other women, rented dedicated spaces, established regular routes through the camps on set days, and created what were effectively small laundry businesses serving dozens or hundreds of clients. The physical labour was hard, scrubbing heavy canvas trousers by hand, hauling water, maintaining fires hot enough to boil washing, but the financial return, relative to the time invested, compared favourably with almost anything the miners themselves were doing. The joke that circulated in the camps that the laundress was getting richer than the miner whose shirt she was washing was not in many cases a joke. Walk into any gold rush mining camp of the late 1840s and early 1850s, and the most important building isn't the assay office, and it isn't the mine, it's the general store. It is the economic centre of gravity around which everything else orbits. It is also, depending on the owner's disposition, either a lifeline or an exquisitely calibrated trap. The general store sold everything: food, tools, rope, nails, medicine of uncertain quality, boots, blankets, candles, seeds, whiskey, and the occasional luxury item: a tin of sardines, a book, a piece of hard candy, which in the context of a muddy mining camp might as well have been a religious artifact. Prices were set entirely by the owner, revised daily based on what the latest supply ship had brought, and occasionally just revised because the owner felt like it. Credit was extended, debts were tracked, and men who hadn't struck it rich found themselves running a tab that quietly grew until they effectively owed the store owner the better part of their future earnings. It was a system that looks, in retrospect, remarkably like the company store model of later industrial America, and the store owners grew rich either way, whether their customers found gold or not. The credit system was where the real power lived. A miner who arrived in camp with limited cash could open a line of credit at the general store, buy his flour, his bacon, his candles, his replacement shovel handle, and pay when he found gold. This sounded generous. It was, in the short term, necessary. Without credit, men with no immediate income would have starved, but the terms of that credit were set by the store owner, and the store owner's primary interest was not in the miner's long-term financial health. Interest rates were high where they were formalised at all, and where they weren't formalised, the store owner simply kept the tab and presented it when payment seemed possible. Men who struck gold paid their debts and walked out. Men who didn't found themselves increasingly indebted, increasingly unable to leave, and increasingly reliant on the store that held their tab. The supply chain behind the general store was its own separate marvel of commercial organisation. The store owner in the mining camp was typically buying from a wholesaler in San Francisco, who was buying from importers receiving goods from the East Coast, from Mexico, from Chile, from China, from Hawaii. At each point in that chain, a markup was applied. By the time a sack of flour had travelled from a Midwestern mill to a Sacramento warehouse, to a supply wagon to a mountain camp, it had been marked up so many times that the price bore almost no relationship to its cost of production. The store owner at the end of the chain knew this and priced accordingly, adding his own margin on top of a price that was already the result of several previous margins. This is why the general store owner, sitting at the end of that chain with a captive customer base and no competition within 20 miles, was one of the most reliably profitable people in the entire gold rush economy. He didn't need to find gold. He just needed to keep the shelves stocked and the ledger accurate. And unlike the miner outside, whose future depended entirely on what the river decided to yield tomorrow, the store owner went to sleep every night knowing that tomorrow morning the miners would be back. Somewhere in the middle of all that gold dust and chaos, someone looked at the situation and asked a question that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely visionary at the time. If everyone is finding gold, who is keeping it safe? The answer at first was nobody, which is to say, everybody was keeping it themselves, tucked in boots, sewn into mattresses, buried in spots that seemed secret until they absolutely weren't. The theft rate in the mining camps was staggering. The lack of any reliable way to transfer money home to families back east was a constant grinding frustration. Into this vacuum stepped companies like Wells Fargo, founded in 1852 by Henry Wells and William Fargo, who had the simple but extremely lucrative idea of offering express delivery, money transfer and gold purchasing services throughout California. They built a network of offices, hired agents, and established a reputation for reliability that was worth as much as any gold seam. They charged fees for every transaction, buying gold dust at a slight discount, transporting valuables for a set rate, and did it at scale, which meant they were processing the wealth of thousands of miners simultaneously. Wells Fargo didn't find any gold. They simply made themselves indispensable to everyone who did. The theft problem in the mining camps was neither surprising nor, by the standards of the time, particularly unusual. You had an enormous population of men, many of them broke or nearly so, living in close quarters with men who had just found gold. You had no banks, no police force worthy of the name, no legal system with the infrastructure to prosecute theft consistently or effectively. The only security for your gold was whatever you could provide yourself, which meant hiding it, sleeping on it, carrying it on your person, or trusting it to someone else and hoping that trust was warranted. All of these strategies failed regularly and predictably. The man who hid his gold in his boot had it stolen when he fell asleep. The man who buried it outside his tent came back to find disturbed earth. The man who trusted a partner found that trust tested in ways it frequently didn't survive. Wells Fargo's insight was that this chaos was not a problem, it was a market. Every miner who had found gold and had no reliable way to store or transmit it was a potential customer. Every merchant in San Francisco who needed to send currency to a supplier in another city was a potential customer. Every family back east waiting for money from a husband or son in California was, indirectly, a potential customer. The company built its network of offices quickly, connecting San Francisco to Sacramento to the major camp towns, and staffed them with agents whose primary qualification was the one the moment demanded most: trustworthiness. In a world full of unreliable intermediaries, Wells Fargo's brand was fundamentally a promise: give us your gold and we will deliver it, or pay you back. They charged fees that reflected both the service and the risk. Gold dust purchased at a modest discount to spot price, express delivery at per-item rates that added up to significant revenue at volume, money orders that allowed miners to send earnings home without physically transporting gold across a continent full of people who would happily take it. The fee on any individual transaction was small. Multiplied by the volume of transactions flowing through the California gold economy at its peak, it became an extraordinary business. Wells Fargo did not get rich from gold. They got rich from being the most reliable part of the machinery surrounding gold, which, in the end, was the smarter position entirely. In a world before telegraphs reached California reliably and before anyone had heard the word internet even in the loosest speculative sense, information was a commodity, expensive, perishable, and deeply valued by people who were making enormous financial and personal decisions based on whatever scraps of it they could find. And newspapers in Gold Rush San Francisco were not merely entertainment, they were practically a utility. Men wanted to know where gold had been found, which routes were passable, which supply ships had docked, which merchants were honest, which gambling houses had been raided, and whether the rumours about another strike at such and such creek were true, or just someone trying to sell a claim. The Alta California, founded in 1849, was among the first major papers, and it sold briskly. The men who ran California's early newspapers charged advertising rates that reflected the captive, cash-flush nature of their readership, and they made out extraordinarily well, not in spite of the gold rush, but because of it. Think about what it meant to be in a California mining camp in 1849 without reliable information. Well, you'd made an enormous, life-altering decision based on rumours and newspaper reports from thousands of miles away. You'd arrived somewhere that looked nothing like the stories suggested. You had no idea whether the creek 2 miles north was producing or exhausted, whether the merchant in the next town was honest or a thief, whether the trail to the next camp was passable or had been washed out by rain. Every decision you made, where to dig, what to buy, who to trust, when to move on, was a decision made in partial or total ignorance, and the consequences of getting it wrong ranged from financial to fatal. In that context, a newspaper was not a luxury, it was a navigation tool. The Alta California understood its readers and served them accordingly. It ran mining reports, accounts from correspondents in the camps describing conditions, the yields and opportunities in specific locations. It ran shipping news, which vessels had arrived, what they were carrying, which had gone down. It ran commercial advertising from the merchants and service providers who understood that the paper's readership was exactly the customer base they needed to reach. It ran legal notices, land claims, court proceedings. It was, in the most practical sense, the information infrastructure of a city that had no other kind. Advertising in the Alta California was priced to reflect the reality that reaching a San Francisco readership in 1850 was reaching one of the most commercially active populations in the country. Merchants paid for space, shipping companies paid for space, hotels and boarding houses paid for space, the express companies paid for space, The revenue from advertising, combined with a subscription and single-copy sales, made the newspaper business in early San Francisco genuinely lucrative for the men who established themselves early and built a readership before competition arrived. The newspaper also served a function that was harder to quantify but equally important. It gave the gold rush a narrative. The stories it told about California, the strikes, the fortunes, the disasters, the personalities, shaped how people understood where they were and what they were part of. Men who had travelled thousands of miles and were living in conditions of considerable difficulty needed, among other things, to believe that what they were doing was significant. The newspaper told them it was. It told them they were part of something historic, something American, something worth the cold mornings and the bad food and the months away from home. That was worth something too, and the men who printed it charged accordingly. When ships began arriving in San Francisco Bay in enormous numbers in 1848 and 49, something remarkable and slightly insane started happening. The crews deserted. Not the passengers, though some of them deserted too, but the crews. They'd arrived in California, heard what everyone else was hearing, and simply walked off the ships and headed for the hills. This left hundreds of vessels anchored in the bay with no one to sail them and no particular plan. San Francisco's response to this situation was magnificently practical. It used the ships as buildings. Hulls were converted into warehouses, hotels, stores, and offices. Some ships were dragged ashore and incorporated directly into the new city's expanding street grid, buried, built over, and forgotten until modern construction workers occasionally punch through the floor of a downtown building and find, to everyone's surprise, a 19th century ship beneath them. The men who acquired these stranded vessels cheaply and converted them into usable real estate made tidy fortunes. San Francisco was, for a few years, a city partially built on ships, which is the kind of detail that sounds like fiction but is, wonderfully, completely true. The desertion crisis was immediate and total. Ship captains who arrived in San Francisco Bay in 1848 found their crews melting away within hours of dropping anchor. A sailor who had been earning the modest wages of maritime labour for months at sea was now standing in a harbour where men were reportedly picking gold out of a riverbed 2 days' walk away. The math was not complicated. The captain could not pay wages competitive with the promise of a California fortune, and the prospect of future voyages to ports that were not California had lost most of its appeal. Ships that arrived with full crews departed, if they departed at all, with skeleton staffs, or none at all. By some estimates, several hundred ships were abandoned in San Francisco Bay at the peak of the crisis, sitting idle at anchor with no one aboard and no practical way to move them. The city's response was improvised, creative, and entirely in keeping with the general spirit of the moment. Entrepreneurs who understood that San Francisco desperately needed storage, commercial and residential space, and that a ship's hull was, structurally, a large enclosed space that could be relatively easily adapted, began acquiring the abandoned vessels at prices that reflected their current uselessness as ships, rather than their potential value as buildings. A hull that would have been worth thousands as a functioning vessel could be bought for a fraction of that cost when it was sitting uselessly in the bay with no crew and no cargo. The conversions varied in ambition and execution. Some ships became simple warehouses, their holds packed with the goods flowing through San Francisco's commercial economy. Others were fitted out as hotels, rough ones, but hotels nonetheless, offering the basic shelter that the city's population needed. Some became saloons, a few became jails. One, the Euphemia, became what may have been San Francisco's first prison. The ships that were dragged fully ashore and incorporated into the city's expanding land area became the strangest of all, buried under fill as the bay was reclaimed, their rotting timbers forming the unexpected foundations of subsequent buildings. San Francisco's modern financial district sits, in part, on a graveyard of gold rush ships. The men who made money from them did so by seeing potential where others saw a nautical inconvenience. Gold rush mining law was, in its early years, essentially improvised. The federal government had not yet established a clear legal framework for mineral claims, which meant that the rules were made up by individual mining camps and enforced by whatever combination of social pressure. Physical intimidation and community consensus was available at the time. Into this legal vacuum came an industry: lawyers. California's bar filled with astonishing speed. Men who had some legal training, or who simply presented themselves with enough confidence that nobody challenged them on it, found that the demand for their services was spectacular. Claim disputes, contract disagreements, fraud cases, inheritance questions for men who died on the trail. There was no shortage of work. Lawyers charged by the day, by the case, and occasionally, it seems, by the complexity of the human confusion they were being asked to untangle. Several of them became genuinely rich. Notably, they got paid whether their client won or lost, which, as any attorney will tell you, is the correct business model. The claim dispute was the foundational legal crisis of the gold rush. A miner staked his claim by marking its boundaries, recording it with the camp's informal recorder, and beginning to work it. This system had several obvious weaknesses. Boundaries were imprecise, marked with stakes and string, and a general wave of the hand rather than surveyed with any accuracy. Recording systems varied from camp to camp and were maintained by whoever had volunteered or been conscripted for the role, and the legal status of the entire enterprise was uncertain from the start, since the land technically belonged to the federal government, which had not yet figured out what to do about any of this. The result was a continuous rolling landscape of disputes. Two men claimed the same ground, each with documentation they considered definitive. A successful claim was jumped by a neighbour who argued the original boundaries were wrong. A partnership dissolved badly and both parties claimed the productive portion. A man died, and 3 different people showed up claiming to be his heir. Every one of these situations was potentially a legal case, and in a camp where the stakes could be the difference between a fortune and nothing, men were willing to spend money on legal representation that they might not have spent on food. The lawyers who established themselves in Sacramento and San Francisco in the early 1850s were serving a client base that was enormous, liquid, and in continuous need. The legal fees they charged were calibrated to gold rush prices rather than the rates that applied back east, which meant that a single contested claim case could pay a lawyer more than a month of ordinary practice at home. The men who built substantial legal reputations in early California, who were known as competent, reliable, and difficult to deceive, attracted clients not just from the immediate disputes, but from the broader commercial litigation that a rapidly growing economy generates in quantity. They got rich, and they did it by profiting from the gap between the law that should have existed and the improvised arrangements that actually did. While the mines were glamorous and the merchants were industrious, one of the quietest and most reliable fortunes being built in Gold Rush, California was in cattle. The math was simple and brutal. Tens of thousands of hungry men, minimal existing agriculture, an enormous and growing demand for beef, and a cattle industry on the edges of California that suddenly found itself sitting on an asset of extraordinary value. Ranchers who had been running modest operations before the rush discovered that their herds had become, effectively, liquid gold. A steer worth a few dollars in 1847 might fetch $40 or $50 in a San Francisco market by 1849. Some ranchers drove their cattle hundreds of miles overland to meet the demand, arriving to find buyers waiting. Others sold on the hoof directly to camp suppliers. Mexican ranchero families who had held land grants in California under previous governance found themselves temporarily among the wealthiest people in the territory, at least until the legal machinery of American land law caught up with them, which is a darker part of the story but a real one. The cattle drives that fed Gold Rush California were not the romantic, song-worthy affairs of the later Texas cattle drives. They were pragmatic, profit-driven operations organized by men who understood that the distance between their herd and a hungry market was, right now, the most valuable gap in California's economy. Ranchers from the great ranchos of Southern California, from New Mexico, from Oregon, and from Texas organized drives north and west towards San Francisco and Sacramento. The cattle arrived lean from the journey, and nobody cared. Beef was beef. The men buying it were not in a position to be selective. The profits from a single successful cattle drive to the California markets in 1849 or 50 were extraordinary by any prior standard. A rancher who had been running a subsistence operation for years, he's selling hides and tallow at modest prices to trading ships, suddenly found himself selling animals on the hoof at prices that were 10 or 20 times what he had been getting previously. The math of even a modest herd, 200 cattle at $40 a head in San Francisco, produced numbers that had not been available to California ranchers at any prior point in history. The darker side of this story involves the Mexican and California ranchero families who held much of the prime grazing land in California under Spanish and Mexican land grants. They profited initially and substantially from the same cattle boom. But the American legal system that followed annexation created a land grant review process that was expensive, slow, and heavily tilted against claimants who did not have the resources or the legal connections to navigate it effectively. Many of the great ranchero families spent their gold rush profits on legal fees defending their land claims and lost anyway. The cattle boom made them temporarily wealthy, and then the legal system made them landless. The food supply chain of the gold rush enriched many people. It enriched some of them only briefly, and for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of their cattle. One of the defining images of early gold rush California, particularly San Francisco in 1848 and 49, is the tent city. Thousands of canvas shelters spreading up the hills and along the waterfront, an entire urban landscape made of cloth and stubbornness. What the pictures rarely show is the commerce built around those tents. Canvas was in extraordinary demand. Rope was critical. Stakes, poles, pins, and the basic hardware of temporary construction were sold and resold and sold again at prices that fluctuated wildly depending on what had just arrived in the bay. The men supplying tents and tent materials were doing brisk, profitable business from the moment the first ships unloaded, and they continued to do so as the population swelled beyond any reasonable expectation. Some of the fabric merchants who arrived early with holds full of cloth made more in their first 3 months than most miners made in their entire time in California, and they did it without a single rainy night, a single cold river, or a single backache from crouching over a pan. Canvas, in 1849 California, was not merely a building material. It was a survival material. A man arriving in San Francisco with no housing arranged, which is to say, essentially every man arriving in San Francisco, needed something between himself and the elements immediately, that same day before dark. The weather in San Francisco was not forgiving. The bay winds were cold and persistent. The fog came in low and heavy and stayed. Rain in winter was not occasional. It was relentless. A tent, however rudimentary, was the difference between a survivable first night and a genuinely miserable one, and for men who had already endured months of difficulty getting to California, the threshold for what they would pay to avoid additional misery was very high. The tent supply business operated at several levels simultaneously. At the simplest level, men sold pre-made tents, basic canvas affairs with poles and rope, to newly arrived migrants directly off the docks. At a slightly more sophisticated level, merchants sold canvas by the yard to men who would cut and sew their own shelters, or hire someone to do it. And at the most ambitious level, some entrepreneurs established what amounted to temporary housing developments, buying land on the hills above the waterfront, erecting tents on it, and renting the tents to arrivals who didn't want or couldn't afford to buy. It was the canvas version of the boarding house, and it operated on the same fundamental logic. Find the need, meet the need, charge what the market bears. The impermanence of the tent city was also its commercial engine. Canvas wears out, ropes fray, poles break. A tent that had survived a San Francisco winter, assuming it survived at all, needed repair or replacement by spring. The men selling canvas and rope had a customer base that returned regularly and predictably for the same goods. It wasn't a one-time sale. It was a maintenance contract with 40,000 clients. Some of the early fabric merchants in San Francisco parlayed their gold rush profits into permanent commercial establishments, dry goods stores, fabric importers, the kind of businesses that could survive the eventual slowdown of the rush by serving the permanent population that was building up behind it. They had started with canvas and ended up with real estate, which was by that point a very familiar gold rush story. Once a miner found gold, he faced a practical problem. What now? Your raw gold dust and small nuggets aren't currency in any formal sense. You can't hand a fistful of flake to a grocer and expect change. What you need is an assay, a formal measurement and evaluation of the gold's weight and purity, which can then be converted into something tradable. The assay offices of Gold Rush, California were therefore indispensable, and the men who ran them understood this perfectly. They charged fees for the assay itself, and they purchased gold at a slight discount to market value, meaning that every single ounce of gold that passed through their hands left them with a small percentage. Multiply that by the volume of gold moving through California in the early 1850s, estimates suggest something like $81 million worth in 1852 alone. And the arithmetic of the assay business becomes very interesting very quickly. The assayers didn't find gold, they simply sat at the intersection of the miners and the economy, collecting a toll in both directions. Gold dust was the everyday currency of the mining camps, and using it was a transaction in itself. A miner paying for supplies would pour dust from a small pouch onto a scale behind the counter, and the merchant would weigh it, calculate its value at the going rate, and deduct the price of the goods. This system required trust in the scale, trust in the merchant's calculation of the gold's purity, trust that the rate being applied was the correct one. In a world without standardized currency, without consistent quality control, and with a significant population of people who were willing to be creatively dishonest when the opportunity arose, that trust was frequently misplaced. Dust was adulterated with sand, with brass filings, with other substances that approximated the color and weight of gold without being gold. Scales were adjusted. Calculations were made to favor the man doing the calculating. The honest miner selling genuine dust at a fair rate was navigating a system that had numerous points at which he could be quietly cheated. The assay office was the answer to this in theory. A professional assayer had the equipment and expertise to measure gold accurately. The correct scales, the acids for testing purity, the knowledge of what a given sample should look like if it was genuine. An assay certificate attached a verified weight and purity to a quantity of gold, making it tradable as a documented commodity rather than as a substance subject to dispute at every transaction. The Federal Assay Office, established in San Francisco in 1850, provided this service officially, and private assay offices operated alongside it for those who preferred a faster or more conveniently located option. The private assayers who established themselves early did very well. Their fee for each assay was modest on any individual transaction, a small percentage of the gold's value, or a flat rate per weighing. But the volume of gold moving through San Francisco at the peak of the rush was staggering, and every ounce of it needed to be weighed and evaluated before it could be spent, banked, or shipped. the assayer sitting at his scale day after day, collecting small percentages from an enormous flow of metal, was building a fortune one careful measurement at a time. It was, as gold rush businesses went, one of the least dramatic and most reliable ways to get rich, which made it, in the long run, one of the best. Men who had travelled 2,000 miles and survived remarkable hardships wanted, it turned out, to prove it. The daguerreotype had been introduced to the public only a decade before the gold rush, and by 1849 it had arrived in California with remarkable speed, along with the photographers willing to operate the equipment. Photography studios in San Francisco and the larger mining towns did extraordinary business. Miners and merchants alike wanted portraits to send home to families, i.e. to document their own existence in a place that felt genuinely historic, even to the people living through it, or simply to have something tangible to show for the adventure. A daguerreotype portrait in Gold Rush, California, could cost between $2 and $10, depending on the size and the establishment, at a time when that represented a substantial sum. Several photographers who set up in San Francisco in the early days built comfortable, lasting businesses. They photographed not just individuals but the city itself as it grew, creating a visual record that historians have spent a century and a half being grateful for. The daguerreotype was not a simple technology. It required silver-coated copper plates, precisely prepared with chemicals before exposure, and developed immediately afterward in a process that involved mercury vapor and a level of technical care that stood in marked contrast to the general improvisation of Gold Rush, California. The equipment was expensive, fragile, and not especially well suited to a frontier environment. The men who brought it to California and made it work, setting up studios in buildings that were themselves still being assembled, maintaining chemical supplies in a supply chain that was unreliable at the best of times, were doing something genuinely difficult and doing it in service of a market that turned out to be enormous. The emotional driver behind the photography boom was, at its core, distance. Men who had left families behind in Ohio or Missouri or New York were acutely aware that the people they had left behind had no image of them, no way to see what they looked like now, older, leaner, weathered by months of outdoor work and uncertain nutrition. A daguerreotype portrait was a way to close that distance, at least partially. You could sit for your portrait in your best clothes, or in your working clothes, if that was the statement you wanted to make, and send a small silver image home to a wife or a mother who would pin it somewhere visible and look at it. This was not a luxury in the sentimental sense. For many families separated by months and thousands of miles, it was a kind of necessity. The photographers who understood this served it skillfully. They advertised in the newspapers. They set up studios in high-traffic locations near the waterfront and the commercial centre, where men who had just arrived or were about to depart were the most likely to be thinking about the people they had left behind. They offered different price points for different sizes and different levels of finish. They photographed not just individuals but groups, mining partnerships, business associations, the crews of ships, creating a commercial portrait market that extended beyond the purely personal. The photographers of Gold Rush, California did not find gold, but they captured the faces of the people who were looking for it, and they built businesses that lasted long after the rush itself had faded, and before Wells Fargo had fully established its network, and before the Postal Service had figured out how to serve a territory that was expanding faster than any map could track. California was served by a collection of private express companies whose business model was elegantly simple. They moved things quickly and reliably, and they charged accordingly. Express riders carried letters, packages, gold dust, legal documents, newspapers, and anything else someone needed transported between towns, camps, and the city. The fee structure was, by any modern standard, remarkable. A single letter delivered between mining towns might cost $1 or more at a time when the official US postal rate was a fraction of that. But the official postal service was slow, unreliable, and not especially interested in the logistical challenges of serving a population scattered across several hundred miles of difficult terrain. The private express companies filled that gap and were rewarded handsomely for it. Several of them were eventually absorbed by Wells Fargo, which understood that controlling the movement of information and wealth was, in some ways, more valuable than controlling the gold itself. The Postal Service's failure in Gold Rush, California was not for lack of trying. It was a failure of scale and speed. The official system had been designed for a settled country, with established roads, known addresses, and a population that stayed in one place long enough for mail to find it. California in 1849 had none of these things. Mining camps appeared, grew, and were abandoned on timescales of weeks or months. Addresses were informal at best and fictional at worst. Roads that were passable in summer became impassable in winter. The Postal Service, operating on federal funding and federal timelines, simply could not adapt quickly enough to serve a population that was itself moving at gold rush speed. The private express riders who fill this gap were often former miners, or men with strong horses and a tolerance for difficult terrain. Their value was speed and reliability, two qualities that the official postal service could not consistently deliver and that the California market valued enormously. A letter that would take weeks through official channels could arrive in days through a reputable express company, and gold dust that needed to move between a mining camp and a San Francisco bank could be transported securely, with the express company assuming liability for loss, a service that no other option provided. The pricing reflected the premium the market placed on these qualities. Express companies charged more per letter than the official postal service, more per package, more per shipment of gold dust. Men paid the premium without significant complaint because the alternative, losing weeks waiting for official channels that might not deliver at all, was worse than the price. Some of the express companies that operated in California in the early 1850s built substantial businesses before the consolidation that eventually brought most of them under the Wells Fargo umbrella. The founders of the successful ones retired comfortably, having built their fortunes not on what was in the packages they carried, but on the willingness of desperate, impatient people to pay for the certainty of delivery. The history of Gold Rush, California is not complete without acknowledging the entertainment economy that developed in the mining towns and in San Francisco, an economy that was, in its early years, largely run by women who had travelled to California, specifically because they understood what was about to happen. The demand for companionship, entertainment, and the specific social comforts associated with the complete absence of family life was predictable, enormous, and very effectively monetized. The women who ran establishments in the entertainment districts of San Francisco and the larger camps, from dance halls to boarding houses to more explicitly commercial operations, and built businesses that generated substantial income. Some of them became wealthy, several became well-known figures in the social life of the city. The entrepreneurial structure of California in the early rush period, in which formal legal and social hierarchies had not yet fully reasserted themselves, created a brief window in which women with business acumen and social intelligence could accumulate capital in ways that would become much harder in subsequent decades. 1849 California was, by the numbers, an almost incomprehensibly male environment. In some mining camps, the ratio of men to women was 20 or 30 to 1. In the city of San Francisco in the earliest period, women represented a tiny fraction of the population. The social and emotional consequences of this imbalance were predictable and immediate. Men who had left behind the entire domestic and social world of home, wives, sisters, mothers, the ordinary texture of family life, found themselves living in a community that offered almost none of those things. The loneliness was documented, pervasive, and in the diaries and letters of the period, described with a frankness that makes clear how genuinely difficult it was. The dance halls that emerged in San Francisco and the larger camps were, at the most basic level, a commercial response to this loneliness. They offered music, which was itself a luxury. They offered the company of women, which in this context was extraordinary. They offered alcohol, dancing, and a simulacrum of the social life that the miners had left behind, imperfect and transactional and expensive, but present in a landscape where almost nothing of the kind existed. The women who worked in these establishments charged for their time, and in a market with this level of demand and this level of scarcity, the rates they commanded were high by any standard. The women who owned and operated the dance halls and related establishments, rather than simply working in them, occupied a different economic tier. They were employers, property tenants or owners, and commercial operators in a market that was generating substantial revenue. Several of them became wealthy enough to move into legitimate commercial real estate, to lend money, and to operate in the formal economy on terms that would not have been available to women in more settled American cities. The window was brief. As California's legal and social structures normalized, the options narrowed, but for the women who used it wisely, it was real. They had seen the rush coming, they had gone to meet it, and they had gotten paid. If you wanted to go gold mining in 1849 California, you needed equipment. This was not optional. You needed a pan, ideally a broad, flat-bottomed iron pan specifically designed to separate gold from gravel using a circular washing motion that sounds simple and is, in practice, extraordinarily tedious. You needed a pick for breaking up compacted earth, a shovel for moving the broken earth, a rocker or sluice box if you were serious about processing volume, waterproof boots if you could get them, and all of this equipment, absolutely all of it, was in catastrophically short supply relative to demand. The men who arrived in California early with holds full of mining equipment made in some cases the equivalent of what today would be millions of dollars in the span of weeks. An iron pan that cost 20 cents back east sold for $15 or $20 in San Francisco in the spring of 1848. A good pick could fetch $30. The hardware merchants who got their timing right didn't just profit from the gold rush, they profited disproportionately, selling at the moment of maximum desperation to men who had no other options and knew it. The iron pan is perhaps the single most iconic object of the gold rush, and its price trajectory in 1848 tells the entire story of the rush's economics in miniature. Before the discovery at Sutter's Mill, a standard tin or iron washing pan was a household item, unremarkable, cheap, available at any general store in any American city for a few cents. By the spring of 1848, when the first wave of California-bound migrants was forming up, the pan had become a specialized piece of equipment with a specific urgent application and a buyer willing to pay almost anything for it. Sam Brannan and the handful of other merchants who understood what was happening bought up every pan they could find before the rush of buyers arrived. When the buyers came, and they came fast and in enormous numbers, the pans were there, priced at a premium that bore no relationship to their cost of production, and every relationship to what the buyer was willing to pay rather than go without. The same dynamic played out across the entire range of mining equipment. Picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, rockers, sluice box components, quicksilver for amalgamating fine gold. Every piece of equipment a miner needed had been repriced overnight from ordinary commodity to essential luxury. Merchants who had positioned themselves correctly, who had bought inventory before the demand exploded, and had the foresight or good luck to be in California when the buyers arrived, were selling at markups of several 100%. The men buying at those prices were not happy about it. Camp letters and diaries are full of bitter commentary about the cost of equipment, but they paid because the alternative was going home. The hardware merchants who thrived beyond the initial boom were the ones who maintained reliable supply chains. The first wave of profit came from existing inventory, but that inventory sold out quickly. The merchants who could continue to bring equipment into California, who had relationships with East Coast manufacturers, who had ships on contract, who could predict what the camps would need and have it there before demand peaked, built sustainable businesses rather than one-time windfalls. They understood that the gold rush was not a single event but a sustained market, and they positioned themselves to serve it not just for a season but for years. In the mining camps of 1849 and 50, the single most anticipated event of any given week was the arrival of mail. Not money, not supply ships, not news of a new strike, mail. Letters from home, letters from wives, mothers, children, brothers, business partners. Men who'd been living in rough camps for months, cut off from everything familiar, yet would wait in lines hours long just for the chance that something had come for them. The emotion attached to letters in this period, described in diaries and memoirs with a rawness that still comes through a century and a half later, makes the commercial opportunity obvious in retrospect. The postal system charged for the letters. Private express companies charged for faster delivery. Stationery merchants sold paper, envelopes, and ink to men who needed to write back. And the men who ran the official distribution points sorting through sacks of mail, handing out letters, watching grown adults try not to cry, were, by virtue of that position, among the most popular people in any camp. Loneliness, it turns out, is an excellent driver of economic activity. The mail distribution system in Gold Rush, California was a logistical puzzle that nobody had fully solved. Letters sent from New York or Boston to a miner in the Sierra Nevada foothills travelled first by ship to San Francisco, then overland by whatever arrangement existed between the port and the interior camps, which in the early days meant private express riders, informal couriers, or men who happened to be heading in the right direction and agreed to carry a sack. Delivery times were measured in months rather than days, and the probability of any given letter arriving at all was not something a sensible person would bet heavily on. Letters were lost, delayed, misdirected to camps that no longer existed, and occasionally delivered to men who had already died, left California, or moved to a different claim 3 mountains over. The men waiting for mail understood all of this and waited anyway, because the alternative, cutting themselves off entirely from home, was worse than the uncertainty. Diaries from the period described the mail queue as one of the most emotionally charged moments of camp life. Men who received letters disappeared into corners to read them privately, emerged red-eyed, and said nothing. Men who received nothing walked away with a studied casualness that fooled nobody. The postal agent sorting through the sacks, calling out names, watching the line, deciding who went home happy and who didn't, held a kind of social power that had nothing to do with his official role and everything to do with the geography of longing. The commercial ecosystem around the mail went in both directions. Men receiving letters needed to write back, which meant paper, or ink, envelopes and candles, or lamp oil for the hours after dark when writing happened. Stationery merchants in the camp towns did steady business supplying these materials at gold rush prices, which were not modest. A sheet of decent writing paper, a commodity costing almost nothing in any American city, was a meaningful expense in a California camp. Men bought it anyway, because the letter home was not a discretionary purchase. It was maintenance of the only connection they had to the lives they had left. The private express companies that carried these letters charged premiums. The official postal service could not match for speed, but the market consistently demonstrated that speed was worth paying for. A miner who wrote a letter in October and wanted his wife to receive it before Christmas, rather than in February, if the official mail felt like cooperating, paid the express premium without significant deliberation. The loneliness of the gold rush was genuine, pervasive, and monetized at every point. The men who built businesses around it did not invent the need. They simply showed up with paper, ink, and a horse and charged what the heartache was worth. Before a man set out for California, he needed information, or at least he thought he needed information, which amounts to the same thing economically. Publishers back east understood this and responded with extraordinary speed and enthusiasm. Beginning in 1848 and accelerating sharply through 49, a flood of guidebooks, pamphlets, almanacs and maps poured off the presses, all purporting to tell the aspiring 49er everything he needed to know about the journey west and the riches awaiting him. The quality of this information was, to be generous, inconsistent. Some guides were reasonably accurate. Others were written by men who had never been further west than New Jersey and were working from newspaper accounts of varying reliability. Some maps showed routes that existed, which was helpful, and some showed routes that did not exist, which was less helpful, especially if you were halfway through the Nevada desert and relying on the map. None of that measurably reduced the appetite for the material. Publishers charged $1, $2, sometimes more for these guides, and sold them by the thousands to men who were going to California regardless, but felt slightly better about it with a book in their pocket. The guidebook industry of 1848 and 49 was one of the earliest examples of what would later be recognized as a reliable commercial pattern. When large numbers of people are about to do something new and frightening, they will buy almost any publication that promises to tell them how. It doesn't matter particularly whether the publication is accurate. What matters is that it exists, that it has a confident title, and that it is available at the moment of maximum anxiety. Publishers who understood this moved fast. Within weeks of Polk's December announcement, titles were appearing in bookshops and newspaper offices across the eastern United States. Guides to the overland route, guides to the Panama crossing, guides to the sea voyage, guides to mining technique, guides to California geography, guides to what to pack and what to leave behind. The accuracy problem was real and widely noted even at the time. Men who returned from California, either having made their fortunes or having failed to do so, compared the guides they had purchased against what they had actually found, and were not always generous in their assessments. Routes described as straightforward turned out to be grueling. Water sources marked on maps were dry. Mining techniques presented as reliable produced nothing. The authors of the less accurate guides were, in most cases, comfortably back east, and had moved on to other projects by the time their readers were sitting in the Nevada desert questioning the map. The publishers who built lasting businesses from the gold rush information market were the ones who adapted as conditions changed. The initial wave of pre-departure guides gave way to a market for California-based publications, newspapers, almanacs, mining reports, real estate guides, serving a population that had arrived and now needed information about where it was rather than how to get there. The men who owned printing presses in the early San Francisco were among the most reliably profitable operators in the city, because the demand for printed information never dropped below the level that made the business viable. Every new arrival needed a newspaper, every merchant needed advertising, every legal transaction generated documents. The press ran continuously, and the men running it were not complaining about the workload. California in 1848 had essentially no banking infrastructure. It had been part of Mexico, then was briefly in legal limbo following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and was operating as a loosely organized territory without the financial systems that even a small established American town would have taken for granted. Into this void came the bankers, sometimes organized, sometimes improvised, occasionally fraudulent, but all of them aware that there was an enormous amount of wealth moving through the territory, and that whoever could create a reliable system for handling it stood to profit substantially. Early California banking was a wild west in the literal and figurative sense. Interest rates were extraordinarily high. The regulatory framework was non-existent. and the line between a legitimate financial institution and an ambitious man with a lockbox and a sign was not always clear. But the legitimate banks that established themselves and built reputations for reliability, including the early iterations of what would become major American financial institutions, created infrastructure that the territory desperately needed, and they were compensated accordingly by a market that had no alternative. The interest rates charged by early California banks were, by any subsequent standard, extraordinary. Monthly rates of 5 to 10% were not unusual in the earliest period, which translates to annual rates that would, in any modern regulatory environment, require significant legal creativity to justify. The men paying these rates were not happy about them. They paid anyway, because the alternative, keeping their gold in a boot, trusting it to an informal arrangement, or simply not having access to credit when they needed it, was worse. In a market with essentially no competition and essentially unlimited demand for financial services, the banks that existed charged what they could get, and what they could get was a great deal. The fraud problem was substantial and persistent. The absence of regulation meant that the barrier to calling yourself a bank was roughly equivalent to the barrier to calling yourself anything else in Gold Rush, California. You needed confidence, a sign, and enough apparent solidity to make customers willing to hand over their gold. Some of the institutions that described themselves as banks in the early rush period were genuine operations with real assets and real intentions to honour their obligations. Others were not, and the depositors who discovered this distinction the hard way lost everything they had entrusted to people who turned out to be optimists at best and criminals at worst. The banks that survived and built lasting businesses did so by doing the one thing the market most needed and least expected: being reliable. In an environment full of uncertainty, a bank that paid out when it said it would pay out, that maintained the gold it claimed to hold, that honoured its letters of credit in San Francisco and Sacramento and the mining camps, that bank was worth an enormous premium to its customers. Reliability in Gold Rush, California was not just a virtue. It was a competitive advantage so substantial that the banks that possessed it effectively had no competition, because the men depositing gold dust were not looking for the lowest fees. They were looking for the institution least likely to vanish with their savings on a Tuesday morning. The gold rush was, among other things, a public health catastrophe in slow motion. Tens of thousands of men, many of them with no experience of rough outdoor living, were suddenly camped in wet conditions, eating poorly, drinking water of dubious quality, performing back-breaking labour, and living in close proximity to each other and to the diseases that close proximity reliably produces. Cholera killed men on the trail before they ever arrived. Dysentery was endemic. Scurvy appeared with uncomfortable frequency among men whose diet consisted primarily of salt pork and whatever they could get from the general store. Injuries from mining work, broken bones, crushed hands, lacerations from tools were constant, and the doctors who set up practice in the mining towns and in San Francisco found themselves with more patients than they could possibly manage. Medical fees in Gold Rush, California were steep by the standards of anywhere else. A doctor's visit could cost several dollars. Surgeries commanded prices that reflected both the skill required and the complete absence of competition within riding distance. The physicians who made it to California early, established practices, and survived the environment themselves did extremely well, in many cases better than the miners they were treating. Scurvy is worth discussing specifically because it illuminates something important about the Gold Rush medical economy. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was entirely preventable by anyone who knew what caused it and had access to fresh fruit or vegetables. The problem was that fresh fruit and vegetables in the mining camps were expensive, intermittently available, and frequently low on the list of priorities for men who were spending their food budget on whatever kept them working. The result was a steady stream of patients presenting with bleeding gums, joint pain, fatigue, and wounds that refused to heal. The classic symptoms of a disease that the medical profession had understood well enough to prevent for decades. The doctors treating these patients charged for their services, prescribed whatever citrus or green vegetables they could source, and watched the same patients return with the same symptoms the following season, because nothing fundamental about the diet had changed. The mining injuries were a separate and continuous category. The work of gold mining in 1849 was physically dangerous in ways that the men undertaking it had frequently not anticipated. Working in cold water for extended periods produced exposure and joint problems. Handling heavy rocks and equipment produced back injuries, hernias, and crushed extremities. The improvised nature of early mining infrastructure meant that sluice boxes collapsed, banks gave way, and the general enthusiasm for getting to the gold quickly occasionally produced engineering decisions that prioritized speed over structural integrity. The doctor in the mining camp dealt with the consequences of these decisions on a daily basis. The physicians who came to California were not all equally qualified. In the absence of consistent licensing standards, the definition of doctor was loose enough to accommodate considerable variation in actual medical knowledge and competence. The men who were genuinely trained, who could set bones correctly and manage infections with some effectiveness, and make reasonable decisions about when surgery was necessary and when it wasn't, were worth significantly more than the market rate in a camp full of injured miners. They knew this, and they charged accordingly. Some of them built practices that were, in gold rush terms, fortunes, not the dramatic, sudden kind associated with a gold strike, but the steady, compounding kind that comes from being indispensable to a large, sick, and continuously replenishing customer base. The wealth generated by the gold rush did not simply circulate in California and evaporate. It crystallized. It calcified into institutions, buildings, families, and names that persist to this day. The mercantile fortunes built in the 1840s and 50s funded the railroads of the 1860s. They built the banks, the universities, the cultural institutions that shaped California as it grew from a territory into a state into the largest economy in the American West. Leland Stanford, who made his fortune as a merchant before entering politics and funding the Transcontinental Railroad, is a name attached today to one of the world's great universities. Mark Hopkins, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, the men known as the Big Four, who built the Central Pacific Railroad, all built their initial wealth not in mining but in the supply and service economy of Gold Rush California. The gold itself, much of it, left California and was absorbed into the broader American and international economy. But the commercial fortunes built on serving the people looking for it, those stayed, grew, and shaped the country in ways that are still visible if you know where to look. Leland Stanford's trajectory is perhaps the clearest example of how gold rush merchant money became something larger. Stanford arrived in California in 1852 and established himself as a wholesale grocer in Sacramento, a straightforward commercial operation that served the mining population and the city's growing permanent resident base. He was not a flashy figure in the rush years. He ran a reliable business, kept his accounts in order, and accumulated capital steadily while the men around him were either striking it rich dramatically or losing everything just as dramatically. By the time the idea of a transcontinental railroad became a serious political and commercial proposition in the 1860s, Stanford had the money, the connections, and the political standing. He was elected governor of California in 1861 to position himself as one of its principal architects. The railroad that Stanford and the other Big Four members built was itself a direct descendant of the gold rush economy, in ways that go beyond the personal fortunes of its founders. The Transcontinental Railroad was justified, funded, yeah, and rooted with the California economy specifically in mind. The wealth that had been generated in the rush years had demonstrated beyond any serious argument that California was worth connecting to the rest of the country. The railroad would make permanent what the rush had made temporary, a continuous flow of people, goods, and capital between California and the eastern United States. The merchants who had grown rich supplying the rush invested in the railroad, not out of sentiment, but because they understood that the infrastructure that had made their businesses possible needed to be made permanent. The universities, hospitals, cultural institutions, and civic organizations that gold rush money funded in the decades following the rush were the visible, lasting face of fortunes that had started with a pan or a general store or a ferry crossing. The men who built them were in many cases aware of the rough origins of their wealth and motivated by something like a desire to transform it into something more permanent and more respectable. Whether that motivation was genuine philanthropy or reputation management, or simply the natural impulse of wealthy men to leave something behind, the institutions they built outlasted them and shaped California in ways that the mines themselves never could. The gold ran out. The legacy fortunes did not. Among the tens of thousands of people who arrived in California during the gold rush, a substantial and historically underexplored community came from China, primarily from the Guangdong province, where word of the Gamsan, the Gold Mountain, had spread quickly. Chinese immigrants arrived in California beginning in 1848, and by 1852 there were an estimated 25,000 Chinese people in the state. The discrimination they faced was immediate, systematic, and often violent. They were barred from many mines outright, taxed specifically and punitively by a foreign miners' tax that targeted them directly and subjected to legal and social violence that the broader history has taken a long time to fully reckon with. Within those constraints, Chinese entrepreneurs built an economic community of remarkable ingenuity. Chinese-owned laundries, restaurants, import businesses, and stores served both the Chinese community and frequently white miners who had no other options for a decent meal or a clean shirt. The produce sellers, the cooks, as the merchants who built Chinatown in San Francisco created institutions that lasted well beyond the rush itself, often out of necessity and always with extraordinary resilience. The foreign miners' tax of 1850 was explicitly designed to extract revenue from non-American miners, and in practice, it was enforced most aggressively against Chinese and Latin American miners, who together represented a substantial portion of the gold rush population. The tax required foreign miners to pay a monthly fee for the privilege of working claims in California. For Chinese miners, who were already working claims that white miners had abandoned or rejected as insufficiently productive, the tax represented an additional burden on an already marginal operation. Many of them paid it, month after month, without complaint and without legal recourse, because the alternative, leaving the mines entirely, was worse than the tax, and the legal system offered them nothing in the way of protection or appeal. The Chinese entrepreneurs who pivoted away from mining and towards service industries made a calculation that, in retrospect, looks like wisdom. The mines were hard, the tax was punishing, and the violence from white miners who resented Chinese competition was real and recurring. But the service economy, laundries, restaurants, stores, offered something the mines did not. A customer base that was not going to suddenly decide it didn't need clean shirts or cooked food. Chinese laundries in the mining camps charged competitive rates, worked long hours, and delivered a quality of service that the market consistently preferred to its alternatives. LA Chinese restaurants in San Francisco fed miners, merchants, and city residents who had discovered that Chinese cooking was, in an environment where most of the available food was terrible, genuinely good. The Chinatown that emerged in San Francisco during and after the rush was not simply an ethnic neighborhood. It was an economic ecosystem, a network of import merchants, labor contractors, family associations, and commercial enterprises that created a degree of community stability and economic resilience in the face of conditions specifically designed to prevent both. The men who built it did so under legal disadvantages, physical threats, and social exclusions that would have destroyed communities with less ingenuity and less mutual support. That the institutions they built survived and eventually thrived is a testament to the same commercial intelligence that drove the best of the rush's other entrepreneurs, applied under conditions that none of those other entrepreneurs had to face. San Francisco in the early rush years was approximately 90% male, which tells you something about the social texture of the place. The women who were there, and there were women from the earliest days, despite the popular image of the gold rush as an exclusively male adventure, occupied an economic position of unusual leverage. A woman who could cook, who could manage a boarding house, who could provide the domestic services that tens of thousands of men had left behind when they walked out their front doors in Ohio or Missouri or Massachusetts, was not merely useful. She was, in the most literal sense, indispensable. Several of the women who arrived in early San Francisco and established boarding houses, restaurants, or domestic service businesses accumulated substantial wealth within a few years. Mary Ellen Pleasant, a black woman who arrived in San Francisco in 1852, built a fortune in real estate and domestic services, eventually becoming one of the wealthiest people of color in California history. Her story, and the stories of other women who built economic independence in the brief window of gold rush social disorder, represents one of the genuinely underexplored chapters of the period. The cooking situation in the gold rush camps was, for most of the men living in them, a continuous low-level crisis. Yet the vast majority of 49ers had not cooked for themselves before arriving in California. Back home, that work had been done by wives, mothers, sisters, or domestic servants, depending on their economic circumstances. In the camps, it fell to whoever in the partnership was least incompetent at it, which in many cases was nobody. Camp cooking at the hands of inexperienced miners produced food that was monotonous, frequently undercooked or burned, and nutritionally catastrophic over any extended period. The men eating it knew it was bad. They had no better option, until a woman showed up and started cooking. A woman who could produce a recognizable meal, beans that were actually cooked through, bread that had risen correctly, meat that had been seasoned with something. Ye could charge prices in a gold rush camp that would have seemed absurd anywhere else. Boarding houses that included meals in their rates attracted clients, the way gold strikes attracted miners, with a combination of word-of-mouth enthusiasm and the straightforward desperation of men who'd been eating burned mush for 3 months. The women who ran these establishments were not simply cooks. They were managers, accountants, supply chain operators, and occasionally debt collectors, running businesses that required continuous attention and produced continuous income. Mary Ellen Pleasant's story is the most documented of these, partly because of her subsequent prominence in San Francisco society, and partly because her life was sufficiently dramatic to attract the attention of historians who might otherwise have overlooked it. She arrived in San Francisco with capital, reportedly $18,000, a sum that reflected either prior success or extraordinary resourcefulness, and possibly both, and deployed it in boarding houses, domestic placement services, and real estate at a moment when all three were producing extraordinary returns. She became wealthy, became influential, and became involved in the abolitionist movement with a directness and financial commitment that matched her commercial energy. She was not the only woman who built something substantial in the gold rush years, but she is the clearest example of what was possible when business acumen met an open market, and a woman refused to be told the market wasn't open to her. The California gold rush didn't end on a specific date, or with a particular announcement. It dissolved. Gradually and then all at once, as the placer deposits, the surface gold that could be reached with a pan, a pick, and a strong back were worked out. By the early 1850s, the individual miner with a pan was being replaced by industrial-scale hydraulic mining operations that required capital, equipment, and organisation far beyond what one man could provide. The surface gold was gone. What was left required companies, machines, and investors, which meant that the window of opportunity for the independent miner had effectively closed. Men who had come west with dreams of independence found themselves working for wages in corporate mines, which was essentially what they had left home to escape. The general stores, the boarding houses, the express riders, the laundresses, many of them found that as the mining population thinned and the easy money dried up, their customer base shrank or moved on. California itself survived and grew, but the specific economic ecosystem of the rush, that brief chaotic golden window, closed, leaving behind a state, a set of institutions, and a mythology that Americans have been drawing on ever since. Hydraulic mining, which replaced placer mining as the dominant extraction method in the early 1850s, was a technology of staggering efficiency and staggering destructiveness. It used high-pressure water jets to blast entire hillsides apart, washing the resulting slurry through sluice systems that captured fine gold particles. It could process in a day what a team of placer miners would take a season to work through. It also deposited enormous quantities of sediment into California's rivers and valleys, raising riverbeds, flooding farmland, and eventually producing a legal battle, the first major environmental lawsuit in American history, that resulted in hydraulic mining being banned in 1884. The technology that replaced the individual miner was itself eventually replaced by its own consequences. For the men who had come to California dreaming of independence, the transition to industrial mining was a profound disappointment. They had left behind wage labour, the factory, the farm, the clerk's desk, in pursuit of something that felt like freedom. Working your own claim, on your own schedule, keeping what you found. The corporate mine offered none of that. It offered wages, supervision, and the same fundamental bargain they had crossed a continent to escape. Some of them stayed and took the wages. Some of them left California and went home, or moved on to the next rush, Nevada, Colorado, Idaho, wherever the promise of surface gold was still alive enough to sustain the dream for another season. The service economy that had built itself around the individual miner contracted along with its customer base. The camp that had supported a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and a laundress with consistent business became a camp that supported none of those things, and then ceased to be a camp at all. The buildings were dismantled and the lumber reused elsewhere, or simply left to decay. The California landscape is still dotted with the ghost towns of the rush years. Places where the commerce was so completely dependent on the specific temporary conditions of the gold economy that when those conditions ended, nothing remained worth staying for. The rush built them overnight and abandoned them just as fast, leaving behind a historical record that is, in its own way, as interesting as anything the mines themselves produced. Almost before the gold rush was over, the process of turning it into legend had begun. Newspapers, dime novels, songs and later films began constructing a version of the gold rush that was cleaner, more heroic, and considerably more profitable than the actual experience of most people who lived it. The image of the rugged individual, alone in the wilderness, sustained by nothing but grit and American ingenuity, finding his fortune through honest labour, this image was marketable, reproducible and extremely useful to a country that was building a particular story about what it meant to be American. The actual gold rush, as we've been discussing, was substantially more interesting. A chaotic, ethnically diverse, socially unstable, commercially brilliant mess in which the people who got richest were often the ones who were smart enough not to go near the mines. But that version doesn't fit as neatly on a poster. The mythology factory ran at full capacity from the 1850s onward, and it is still running today, which is why the image most people have of the gold rush involves a prospector with a pan, rather than a dry goods merchant with a very healthy profit margin. The dime novel industry that emerged in the 1860s and flourished through the end of the century built its California stories on a foundation of selective memory and commercial instinct. The heroes of these stories were strong, solitary, morally uncomplicated men who triumphed through physical courage and personal virtue. The gold rush in this telling was a test of character, a crucible in which genuine Americans were separated from the weak, the cowardly, and the foreign. The complexity of the actual rush, the Chinese community building institutions under systematic oppression, the Mexican ranchero families losing their land through legal manipulation, the women building businesses in a social environment designed to exclude them, had no place in this narrative. It was edited out, not with malice exactly, but with the practiced efficiency of a storytelling industry that knew what its audience wanted and was not interested in complicating it. Mark Twain, who spent time in California and Nevada during the rush years and wrote about it in Roughing It, published in 1872, was one of the few writers to capture both the comedy and the pathos of the experience with genuine accuracy. His California is populated by incompetents, dreamers, fraudsters, and occasional genuine characters, a world that is funny precisely because it is true. But even Twain's version became, over time, part of the mythology, the tall tale tradition, the frontier humour, rather than a corrective to the legend. The legend was simply more useful than the truth, and usefulness in the American cultural economy tends to win. The mythology of the gold rush has done real work in American culture for a century and a half. It has justified westward expansion, celebrated individual enterprise, and provided a usable origin story for California's economic identity. It has also, in doing all of those things, consistently obscured the people and stories that didn't fit the template. The supply merchants, the laundresses, the Chinese entrepreneurs, the women building boarding houses, they were there, they were essential, and they made money. They were just, for a long time, not the story America wanted to tell about itself. That story is still being corrected. In January of 1848, San Francisco was a small settlement of perhaps 800 people, many of them recent arrivals who had come with the US military or the early American commercial interests following the end of the Mexican-American War. 2 years later, it was a city of 25,000. 2 years after that, it was approaching 100,000, one of the fastest urban growths in recorded American history, built on commerce, ambition, and the specific chaos that follows when an enormous amount of wealth passes through a single point. The city that emerged from the gold rush was not simply a large version of a small town. It was something new, cosmopolitan, diverse, economically aggressive, architecturally improvised, and deeply aware of its own significance. San Francisco in 1852 had newspapers, banks, theatres, churches, schools, and restaurants, serving food from a dozen countries, were all constructed on land that had been, 4 years earlier, mostly marsh. It was a monument to what happens when the commercial instinct is given essentially unlimited raw material to work with and no time to be cautious. A city built not on gold, but on everything that gold required. The fires are an important part of the story and an underappreciated one. San Francisco burned 6 times between 1849 and 1851, major conflagrations that destroyed substantial portions of the city each time, the result of wooden construction, high winds off the bay, and the general absence of any fire prevention infrastructure worth mentioning. Each fire that reduced blocks of commercial buildings to ash was followed within weeks by rebuilding, faster each time, slightly more substantial each time. The city learning from its own destruction at a pace that would have been impossible in any place less motivated by commerce. The men who owned land in the commercial districts lost their buildings in the fires and rebuilt, because the land was worth rebuilding on. The city that emerged from the fires was gradually less wooden and more brick, more permanent, more serious, more like a city that intended to stay. The diversity of early San Francisco was genuine and striking by the standards of any American city of the period. The port received ships from Chile, Peru, Mexico, Hawaii, China, Australia, and every major European commercial power. The men and women who arrived on those ships did not all leave. Many of them stayed, opened businesses, established communities, and became part of the permanent population that was building up behind the transient mining wave. By 1852, San Francisco had a functioning Chinese quarter, a substantial Latin American community centered in what was called Chilean Hill, a French community with its own newspaper, and a commercial district that conducted business in half a dozen languages simultaneously. It was, by accident and necessity, cosmopolitan, a characteristic that would define it long after the rush had faded into legend. The city that gold built was not built by gold. It was built by the people who understood that gold was simply the occasion, the specific, temporary reason why tens of thousands of people had converged on one spot at one moment. The merchants, the bankers, the lawyers, the laundresses, the newspaper publishers, the boarding house operators, the photographers, they were the ones who built the permanent city. They looked at the chaos around them and saw not a rush but a foundation. San Francisco is still there, the gold is long gone, and the people who got richest from the rush were, almost to a person, the ones who understood that distinction from the very beginning. Gold Rush California was, by any measure, one of the most linguistically diverse places on Earth in 1849. Spanish-speaking miners had arrived from Mexico, Chile, and Peru. Cantonese speakers had crossed the Pacific from Guangdong. French speakers had come from France, from Louisiana, from the Caribbean. Hawaiian sailors had jumped ship in the bay. Australians, Germans, Italians, and Irishmen crowded the same muddy trails and the same crowded camp stores, all of them trying to conduct business in a territory where nobody had agreed on a common language and nobody had time to learn one. Into this beautiful, chaotic, multilingual mess stepped a category of person whose value was immediately and abundantly obvious: the interpreter. The man who could negotiate in Spanish in the morning, conduct a business transaction in French at noon, and explain a legal document to a Chinese merchant in the afternoon was not merely useful. He was, in the specific conditions of Gold Rush California, extraordinarily well compensated. Language was a commodity. Fluency was a fortune. And the people who possessed both and understood what they were worth collected accordingly. The practical need for interpretation showed up at every level of commercial life. The general store transaction was the simplest version. A Spanish-speaking miner needed supplies, the English-speaking merchant had them, and the gap between them was costing both of them money every minute it went unresolved. A bilingual third party who could broker that transaction quickly and accurately was worth the fee being charged, and the fee being charged in Gold Rush California was never modest. Merchants who employed bilingual clerks specifically to serve non-English-speaking customers did more business than their competitors, not because they were more generous, but because they had eliminated a friction that was costing everyone involved. The legal applications were even more valuable. A miner who didn't speak English was a miner who couldn't file a claim correctly, couldn't dispute a decision made against him, couldn't understand the contract he was being asked to sign, and couldn't effectively access any of the legal protections that theoretically existed for him, however limited those protections were in practice, An interpreter who could accompany a client through a legal proceeding, translate accurately, and explain the implications of documents and decisions was providing a service that had genuine, quantifiable consequences. Get it right, and the claim was filed, the dispute was resolved, the contract was understood. Get it wrong, and the client lost his claim, signed away his earnings, or found himself bound to terms he had not intended to accept. The Chinese community developed its own interpretation infrastructure with particular sophistication. The 6 companies, a collective of district associations that provided services to Chinese immigrants in California, maintained interpreters as part of their organizational function. These were not simply translators, but cultural navigators, men who understood both the formal requirements of American commercial and legal life and the specific concerns and circumstances of the Chinese immigrant community, and who could bridge the two in ways that a straight linguistic translation often could not. They were among the most important figures in the Chinese community, their services essential to the community's ability to function in a legal and commercial environment that had been designed without them in mind. The interpreters who built lasting businesses in Gold Rush, California, were the ones who combined linguistic ability with commercial instinct, who understood that their value lay not just in the translation but in the trust they generated on both sides of a transaction. A merchant who trusted his bilingual clerk to represent his interest accurately with Spanish-speaking customers was giving that clerk a position of genuine power. A miner who trusted an interpreter with the details of his legal situation was trusting him with his livelihood. That trust, reliably honoured, was the foundation of a business that no amount of gold dust could easily replicate. California's geography in 1849 was not cooperating. The gold was in the Sierra Nevada foothills, the supplies were in San Francisco, and between them lay the Sacramento Valley, flat, fertile, and cut through by rivers that, in the wet season, were neither small nor gentle. The American River, the Sacramento River, Hubbardsand, the Feather River, the Yuba River, all of them stood between the miner and his destination, and none of them came with bridges. Not yet. The men who figured this out early and positioned themselves at the crossing points with a boat, a raft, or even a reasonably sturdy piece of lumber and a pole did not have to look very hard for customers. Every man heading to the mines had to cross at least one river to get there. Every supply wagon heading inland had to cross to deliver its cargo. Every letter, every package, every barrel of flour going to the camps crossed on something, and the person operating that something charged for the privilege. The ferryman of Gold Rush, California was not a romantic figure. He was a businessman sitting at a geographical choke point with a captive customer base and no competition, and he priced accordingly. The ferry business operated on simple economics that rewarded positioning above almost everything else. A ferry crossing at the right point on the right river, where the water was too deep to ford, where traffic was heavy, and where there was no reasonable alternative route, was worth a fortune regardless of the quality of the vessel or the competence of the operator. Men paid $2, $5, sometimes more for a crossing that took 10 minutes, because the alternative was a detour of many miles or a swim through fast-moving water in a California spring runoff. Neither option was attractive. The ferryman knew this, and his prices reflected it with the straightforward honesty of someone who has nothing to prove and no reason to discount. John Sutter, whose sawmill had started the whole thing, attempted to profit from the river crossings on his property and found himself overwhelmed by the volume of traffic. Other men established regular ferry services at key points along the Sacramento and its tributaries, building operations that ran continuously during the peak years of the rush. The most successful ferry operators did not just operate a single crossing, they built networks, establishing service at multiple points, hiring crews, and creating something approaching a transportation infrastructure in a territory that had almost none. The bridge builders who followed the ferryman represent the next chapter of the same story. As California's population stabilized and the need for permanent infrastructure became clear, the men who had made money on ferries invested it in bridges, toll bridges, which preserved the revenue model of the ferry while providing a more reliable and more scalable service. A toll bridge on a major river route in California in the early 1850s was, functionally, a license to collect money from everyone moving between the coast and the interior. The men who owned them collected that money for years, quietly building fortunes that had started with a plank and a pole and ended with substantial commercial real estate and the kind of civic prominence that comes with having built something a city actually needed. They had charged a tax on movement in a territory that was nothing but movement, and they had gotten very rich doing it. Let's be precise about something the history books sometimes gloss over. Gold Rush California drank an extraordinary amount, not in the casual, the social sense of a population that enjoys a drink in the evening, in the sustained industrial, economically significant sense of a market that was consuming alcohol at a rate that made the men supplying it among the most reliably profitable operators in the territory. The numbers, where they can be reconstructed, are striking. San Francisco in 1850 had more saloons per capita than almost any city in the world. The mining camps, which had almost no other entertainment infrastructure, centered their social life on the saloon in a way that made the demand for alcohol as predictable as the demand for food. The men who imported whiskey, brandy, wine and beer into California in the rush years, the wholesale importers who supplied the saloons, the merchants and the camps, were operating one of the most reliably profitable businesses in the territory. They did not need to predict whether the mines would produce. They only needed to predict whether men in difficult circumstances would drink. That particular forecast required no special skill. The import business for alcohol was more sophisticated than it might appear. California in the early rush years produced almost no alcohol domestically. The vineyards that would eventually make the state famous were decades from maturity, and the grain crops necessary for whiskey production had barely been planted. Everything had to come from somewhere else. Whiskey arrived from the eastern United States, shipped around Cape Horn or across the Isthmus. Brandy came from France, from Peru, from Chile. Wine came from wherever wine could be sourced, at whatever quality was available and whatever price the market would bear. The quality varied enormously. The demand did not vary at all. The importers who established themselves as reliable suppliers of recognizable products, who could promise a saloon owner that the next shipment would contain actual whiskey, rather than the ambiguous liquid that sometimes arrived under that label, commanded premium prices and loyal customers. Brand recognition in the alcohol trade of Gold Rush, California, was a genuine commercial asset. A saloon whose customers knew the name on the barrel and trusted it was a saloon that could charge more per glass and retain customers who might otherwise drift to a competitor. The importers who supplied that consistency were compensated for it. The domestic production of alcohol that eventually developed in California grew directly from the commercial infrastructure that the importers had built. The men who'd been importing wine identified the valleys where grapes could be grown, invested in vineyards, and began the transition from importer to producer with the commercial instincts they had developed serving the rush market. The California wine industry of the late 19th century, which would eventually become one of the most significant in the world, traces a direct line back to the Gold Rush alcohol economy. The miners who drank rough imported brandy in 1849 were, without knowing it, funding the infrastructure that would eventually produce something considerably more refined. They would not have cared. At the time, they just needed something strong enough to make the end of a long, cold, unproductive day feel slightly less like defeat. And so here we are, at the end of the trail. The pans are empty, the tents have come down, and the last barrel of suspiciously labelled whiskey has been drunk by someone who definitely deserved better. The California Gold Rush is over, or at least our night in it is. Think about what you just witnessed. Hundreds of thousands of people dropped everything, their jobs, their families, their perfectly adequate lives, and crossed a continent or an ocean on the strength of a rumour. They arrived somewhere that looked nothing like the brochure, found the work harder than advertised, the prices higher than anything they had ever seen, and the gold considerably more elusive than the man in the newspaper had suggested, as most of them did not get rich. Many of them went home poorer than they had left. Some of them did not go home at all. And yet, from that chaos, from that beautiful, exhausting, gloriously improvised mess, something real was built. A city rose out of the mud and the shipwrecks and the canvas tents. A city that would become one of the great ones. Institutions were established that are still standing. Fortunes were made that funded railroads and universities and hospitals. A population of extraordinary diversity arrived from every corner of the world, and despite every effort to keep them separate, built something together. The real heroes of the gold rush were not always the ones with the pans. They were the woman charging $6 to wash a shirt, fully aware that the man paying it had no alternative and no complaints coming. They were the Chinese laundry owners building a community under conditions designed to prevent it, with the same quiet stubbornness that builds everything worth building. They were the ferrymen at the river crossing, watching the traffic go by and thinking, someone has to get them across and it might as well be me. They were the newspaper editor, the assayer, the boarding house keeper, the photographer capturing faces that history would otherwise have forgotten. They remind us of something that the myth tends to obscure, that in any great human upheaval, the people who build lasting things are rarely the ones chasing the obvious prize. They are the ones who looked at the crowd running toward the gold and asked quietly and practically, what does that crowd need? And then they went and provided it, at a reasonable markup, and built something that outlasted the rush itself. So tonight, as you settle deeper into whatever comfortable arrangement you have made for yourself, your mattress that did not cost you a month's wages, your blanket that has not been shared with 12 strangers, your bedroom that does not smell like a San Francisco boarding house in the summer of 1849, maybe take a moment for the 49ers, for the ones who found nothing and went home anyway, with stories that were worth more than gold and a tolerance for hardship that most of us will never be tested to match. For the ones who found everything and lost it just as fast, because the rush gave and the rush took, and it was never especially sentimental about which it did first. They were stubborn and hopeful, and frequently mistaken about their own prospects, and deeply human in all of it. And somehow, out of all of that muddy, freezing, overpriced, underlaundered chaos, they built California. Good night.